things to speak extemporaneously. There are a number of things that struck me about the talk so far. So first, I'd say yes to just about everything you said. I agree with that in terms of where the industry needs to go and some of the technology improvements that are needed to be had. And it's kind of interesting in looking at the i5, where M2M is it's about nearly a $10 billion industry. And from my perspective, the ideate is there. So there are plenty of ideas, and people are thinking about the ideas. But where we are as an industry is we need to improve the innovation. The innovation, which then will incite new business models and give the growth potential, make that growth potential real for the industry by getting new business models, because that's going to ignite the number of connections and the number of machines which will connect and deliver data. And then finally, it will inspire all sorts of applications and improvements in people's lives. I really loved what you were talking about in terms of making it practical around why does this matter? Why does it matter to people in India? Why does it matter to people around the world that M2M exists? And a lot of times I think we, in the industry, we get ourselves focused too much on what is it for us as opposed to what is it for our customers? What is it for our users? What benefits are going to be generated? And I thought that your talk was excellent in terms of trying to bring it home. So with that, I'd like to just take a few minutes and take 1 second about Aris Communications. You may not know anything about us, and so maybe that'll give you a little context. Aris Communications is an operator in North America. So we're a cellular operator. We built a network. We built it for machines. We currently have over 1 million machines that connect across our network, and we do over 100 million transactions a day. So we think, drink, eat, and as we say at the office, we love machines. So I want to encourage people. I'm going to try to certainly stay to my 14.5 minutes, which are remaining, but I'll even try to make it shorter than that so that I can answer as many questions as possible. I'm married, I have 2 children, and we have a bunch of employees, and trust me, I never get 17 minutes uninterrupted of speaking. So, so there's always somebody interrupting, so I'm comfortable with that, so feel free if there's a question. Anyway, just sort of starting out just a little bit about the machine-to-machine industry. It's probably it must be the large but somewhat disappointing industry out there, in that if you talk to people who over the long term have been around machines and the machine-to-machine industry, it's always been, this is the year it's going to explode. This is the year it's going to explode. And it actually hasn't exploded very often. And even though it hasn't exploded, we think it's roughly nearly $9 to $10 billion of revenue worldwide. That includes hardware, software, services, et cetera. So it's a sizable industry, and depending on who you talk to, the growth is somewhere between 15% and 25% annually. Still, that's nothing compared to what you're hearing from the hype machine. So if you talk to Cisco and they talk about their Internet of Things, John Chambers talks about $14 trillion of revenue over the next 10 years. GE yesterday came out with their latest announcement talking about the industrial internet and their desire to connect all sorts of machines through what they call the industrial internet, which is really machine to machine in a different format. So why is it? What's going on? What's happening here where you have Cisco, you have GE, you have all of these companies? What's your M2M strategy? That's one thing that the financial analysts are asking almost every public company in North America. What's your M2M strategy? Why? What's the hype all about? So I think that M2M just generally has the ability to disrupt and transition many, many, many industries. And I particularly think that it's the case here in India, in that of that $9 to $10 billion number worldwide, our best guess is something less than 5% is in India. And you have to ask yourself, why, given that India has such a, I believe there are 900 million people with cell phones in India, which is the second highest number anywhere in the world. Why has M2M not taken off? Well, I think there are a few reasons for that. First and foremost, I think that it's been too hard, that it's just a very difficult, it's a difficult industry in that there are lots of industry participants, and as many of the speakers have said already, there are not a lot of standards that are being adopted on a widespread basis. So in listening to the challenges of putting together a factory, this was something that you all had to do yourselves. You had to come in and figure out, put the people and the energy and the resources behind getting an ecosystem partners to join with you in building that factory and that manufacturing facility and getting those standards and getting them to build to a standard. But we don't have standards, and we don't have standards that are universally acknowledged and accepted, which is one of the problems. The second, as you might expect with any industry that's supposed to go from, sort of 6 or 7 billion a couple of years ago to something trillion over 10 years, the reality is that there are lots and lots of companies who want part of the pie. So there are tons and tons and tons of industry participants in M2M, and very few of them are at scale. If I asked you to raise your hand and name me a $1 billion M2M company, I don't think I'd have very many people raising their hands today. So the point being is that it's a very fragmented industry and a very complex life cycle, and as a result, those factors are slowing down the M2M adoption around the world. Now, it's my belief that many of the people in the room can have an impact on the adoption rates. I believe that there are many things we can do from an innovation perspective that can start leading to the insight, the ignite, and the inspire by technology development and being able to make things more simple for customers, easier for them to deploy, and be able to come to market more quickly than they have before. Some of the innovations have been touched on. The cloud will be a big part of getting customers to market faster than what they have before. But there are also technologies that have not yet been fully developed and haven't been fully deployed. For example, it's my view that there are multiple wireless technologies that will come into this equation. It's not only cellular. And so cellular needs to be used for the appropriate applications, typically high data use, more expensive applications that can handle more expense. And I think it will be very, very difficult to have a cellular environment in the home that will deploy applications in a widespread manner. In addition to that, I believe that it's going to be important to have managed services. And so right now you have this gap. At the high end, you have cellular, which is a managed service by your carrier. And then you have a proliferation of what I'll call self-managed technologies, Bluetooth, and I heard people were asking about near-field communications. You've got Wi-Fi. You've got all sorts of ways to communicate, but they aren't managed. And when you get to mission-critical data, it becomes important that that data is managed. And so what I think you will see is that you will see a variety of new technologies that will come into play from a wireless perspective that will be managed, though, so that the reliability will be there, the security will be there, and the enablement of the industry will ultimately be there. Now, I just used two words, reliability and security. And so I want to spend just a couple of minutes on reliability and security. So in the US, there was a famous ad which was run where, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" And it was all about how sporadic and difficult wireless network communications were in using your cell phone. And we believe that the same issues are relevant when it comes to machines, in that machines are not going to handle being able to get cut off, redial, retransmit, especially when the application is for real-time information or near real-time information. So if you think about machines, the concept of reliability is critical. And I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about that reliability. So Aris Communications, as I mentioned, our first generation here is being an operator in North America. Well, one of our big industries is the car industry. So over the last 12 months, we've launched programs for Hyundai, Honda, Fiat, and Chrysler in North America. And you may ask that why, other than our partnership with Tech Mahindra and Mahindra Satyam, why is it that we were able to get this business? Well, actually, that partnership was important, but also because we were able to, in drive testing, and each of these car companies literally took cars and drove throughout the United States. In drive testing, I'll use the Hyundai example, where they had a Hyundai car and an OnStar car, and they drove at the same time throughout the country, weeks of driving around. Turns out that our network was more reliable, and by about 20 to 30%. So messages came through on time 20 to 30% more often than the OnStar solution. Why is that? The reason for that is because we felt that quality of service was critical for machines. That in spending time understanding machines, we created a whole set of technology that allowed for consistent quality of service and understanding if there was a problem where, like, how many of you have gotten text messages backwards or delayed or whatever? In the machine world, that can't happen. And so it becomes important to create the technology and the processes that allow for consistent, reliable communications. And so that's part of how we were able to win the Hyundai business, is just simply as they drove around the country, our SMS messages operated better, our data traffic operated better. When an airbag deployed and it was a life-critical situation, was the public safety group, were they able to get that message on time consistently? And the answer was yes. So machines have different requirements than people do, and we believe that it's going to be important for the network operators to understand the needs and the special infrastructure and the special platforms that are required in order to provide reliable communications. The other word that came up was security. And so one of the questions, I believe it was in your talk, you were talking about how important it was, such that you wanted to make sure that there was control going to the end device, that it wasn't a free-for-all, that anybody could get to that end device. So part of the reason that we were successful with these car companies, and part of what we believe is the wave of the future for machines, is that our network setup is no third party can get to anyone else's device. So just like I can call any of you and you can call any of me, you can't call our devices. So there are a set of specific permissions that are associated with getting to a particular device, and that's held by the people that own them. And we believe, again, that this is the kind of technology and the kind of security that's going to be required to actually really ignite this industry. I can talk forever about things that we've done and this, that, and the other thing, but the truth is that we're only in the first quartile of the innovation that'll be required to drive 50 billion connected devices in 2020, to drive that $14 trillion growth that John Chambers talks about. Instead, I believe that there is a lot of room for innovation. There's a lot of room for good ideas and for new technologies to get developed to really accelerate the machine industry. The final thing that I'll say before I stop and take questions is that one of the things that's not been discussed much in this industry is there's a lot of hype, but there's not a lot of profit. And I believe that there is going to be a need for increased focus on profitability, which means increased automation, which means increased reliability, which means increased innovation from all of us as we go forward. But we believe that profitability, that the connections won't happen if the carriers and the operators aren't profitable, and if the ecosystem partners are not profitable. And right now, if you look across the industry, you don't see a lot of profit. So with that, I think I'm close. Look at that, minute and 20 seconds ahead of time. And I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone would like to pose.
Yeah, my question is relevant to the standards. I mean, most of the speakers have talked about standards, and there's no single player that is driving the standards. So what do you think? Is it the telecom TSPs that are going to drive the standards? Is it going to be the ecosystem? Because that's an extremely fragmented piece of it. Will it be the platforms? Who will drive the standards eventually in the next 10 years?
So what I think will happen in phase one is that operators will get platforms that are, hopefully those platforms will be dynamic and allow the customer to innovate as it relates to their business model. So innovate in terms of billing, innovate in terms of whether it's pay per use or it's time of day, but where the application can be innovative. I think that the platforms, which will encompass both software and hardware and look at the machine world as a system, will really, that actually, the success of those platforms is what's ultimately going to drive standardization. Right now, I think it's very difficult to get any meaningful standardization because there are so many different companies coming at the industry so many different ways and no clear impetus with which to develop that standardization. Part of the problem that the carriers are having, back to the profitability, is that it's hard for them to put a lot of money into this segment because the average revenue per unit can be 10% or less of what they get from a phone. And so their systems and their way of thinking is not geared toward creating the environment that's going to allow for the igniting of this industry. So I think standardization will get there, but I don't see, if you ask me over the next 2 or 3 years, is there going to be a massive move towards standardization? I don't see it.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Venkat Gajal. You talked about an important point from the sustainability of the industry, that is with respect to the profitability of the industry.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate more in terms of the revenue potential or the revenue streams of this MTM industry? And second, what are the 2 or 3 key changes that you expect in the ecosystem that would enable a better profitability or the boom that you are expecting in this industry?
So first of all, I think that the biggest part, if you look over the medium to long term, to me, by far, the greatest value, which means the greatest profits, are going to come from the data. So it's not around the transport of the data. It's actually about the data and being able to use it to create actions which create value. And so from my standpoint, I believe that the data analytics, the data mart, the application enablement, where in fact you're doing the things that are leading to value that entities are willing to pay for, is where ultimately that's where a half of the industry's profits, maybe a little bit more, it'll be in that segment. Unfortunately, though, to get there, the operators have to find profitability, and that they aren't going to invest in all of the things that are going to enable that if they can't find profitability. And right now, they've been focused on business models where it's the amount of megabytes that they're transporting is the methodology by which they get paid. And as prices are coming down for that, there's just not enough volume to keep up for them to turn that into a really sustainable, profitable margin, particularly at the price points which are necessary for those applications to be deployed. So I think that what will ultimately be required from a business model standpoint for the operators to start making money is to be able to enable the business models that customers really want, which is not necessarily how they've done business in the past, which is around either subscriptions or where basically you have a fixed billing platform that says you can have A, option B, or option C, good luck with that. Instead, there's going to have to be a much greater movement toward pay for use. So that, for example, in one of the examples that came up around wanting to know when the water was turning on or was turning off, that event-based billing, something that you're willing to pay for because you care about knowing about that event, but just generally subscribing to, well, notify me every, it may happen, it may not happen, but pay me 3 rupees an hour for doing this. Those kinds of billing mechanisms are not the ones that I think are going to lead to the growth. So enabling new business models and getting the operators profitable, that then is going to lead to what I believe is the real value, which is the data.
We talked about different concepts, home and automotive and industry. How do you see the role of regulation coming into these, or a government coming into it to make them standards enforceable? Because so far this has been, do you see any part of the world where regulation has been brought on these lines in making these mandatory, so that helps the growth?
Yes.
And you also touched about the profitability, and I mean from a network operator or from any other player which is there. So if this kind of a model shows economic saving for any user or any group of users, then sharing that saving is a way of profitability. So those kind of models, is that something which you are seeing anywhere?
Yeah. So starting with the regulation, yes, obviously regulation can, and like in Europe, there's a connected car regulation that has started driving the connected car industry within Europe. And so regulation absolutely can have an impact, but I think generally that the largest applications for machine-to-machine haven't been created yet. And so the real question is, are you going to get a group of developers that are really focused on the industry and trying to create all sorts of things for the home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I think that regulation will play a part, but I don't know whether it's going to be the incentive as opposed to adding on, because I think that if we wait for government regulation, by the time they finish studying it, you're talking another 5-6 years out. So guaranteed, if the projections of 50 billion connected devices and 14 trillion are true, or even half true, government regulation will not be the most meaningful part of that. So I think that the technologies are starting to come out now where people can be profitable, meaning that, so for example, in our business, we are running roughly about 20% EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And so, but I think we're a rarity as it relates to companies in the space. I look at the largest, Sierra Wireless is probably the largest radio manufacturer in the M10 space. They're a little over 300 million in revenue, and I think last quarter they made about $1 million. And so it's pretty hard to have a sustainable business where you're generating that, and they had been unprofitable before that, and before that, and before that, and before that. So I think that it's a real issue around the profitability of the operators, and there's a real issue around whether they can and are willing to invest the resources on their own without third-party help to be able to generate, to have the capabilities that are going to allow for the profitability that they need. It really gets, if I could add one more, that's not an I, it's just automation. The automation of so many things. They're used to call centers and doing things around phones, and that's just not this business. It's not this business. It's a totally different set of requirements.
So I heard about this International M2M Council has been formed, right? In Las Vegas, I think it was May.
Yeah.
And there are a good set of companies in there with Deutsche Telekom and Oracle and a few others. So what is your feeling about that? Is that something you think is going to set up a standard in the industry, or other people are going to add on to the council, or is it a very closed council?
So our chief technology officer attended, and I bet that he attends 10 to 12 standards bodies a year. And so that's my answer. He attends 10 to 12 standards bodies a year, and I'm not intimately involved in any of it, but it hasn't come to the point where he's come to me and said, Mark, this is the one that I believe people understand what they're doing, that the momentum is building, we should really double down ourselves and try to support this standard. Instead, he feels that we still need to support all 10 or 12. And if you multiply that by ecosystem partners, you multiply that by customers, it just gets, it's a very unwieldy scenario, and we're in the business.
I just wanted to understand how exactly does ARIS function. So do you piggyback on TSPs like Verizon? Are you actually setting up towers and having these packets of data and operating like a typical this thing? Because you talked about profitability. So yeah. I kind of don't see how is it that if the biggies out there are not able to make that kind of EBITDA, how is it that you guys are able to make it? Right. Question number 2, if you're able to do it, do you think you can replicate it in a country like India as well?
So yes to the second question. With your help, of course. So just to the second question, and I'll get back to how we do it in a minute. With the second question, we're in the process now of expanding our services around the globe. And so we've got Raju and his team who are working closely with us on go-to-market strategies. We'll probably have other ecosystem partners as we go and do it. Absolutely, we think we can. Absolutely, we think we can be profitable, and it's around technology. It's around innovation. So in addition to what we've talked about, we've got a big software team that is we create our own billing system. We create our own way of activating things. We create our own network hardware. So it's all a question of what kind of technology capabilities you have, and can you bring them around the specific requirements for machines, because that's how you save costs. I'll digress for 30 seconds. So if you think about it for a second, and the car company wants to manufacture somewhere, but it wants to export their car anywhere around the world. So at his location, you want to build that car, you want to test that car, you want to test everything about that car, the communications, whatever, and you want it ready to roll. But you're not ready to pay for it, right? I mean, from a communications perspective, you're not ready to, there's no customer associated with it yet. It needs to be tested and ready to go, but it's got to somehow make its way to an end customer somewhere. And in the middle of that, you don't want your dealer to be responsible for activating the car. The dealer is in the business of selling cars. It's not in the business of making this communication stuff work. So part of the reason that we won all these car companies is because we created technology that allowed for the car to be ready to go on the manufacturing floor, but doesn't trigger billing until there is sufficient traffic coming from that device that we agree with the customer, and that's when billing commences. And it's all done automated. So nobody has to get involved. Those are the kinds of things that this market requires. Last thing, just to answer your question, sort of technical, how we're set up. So we essentially lease the RAN, the radio access network, from, in the US, we probably do, for CDMA, it's 35 different carriers. In GSM, which we will be introducing here shortly, it'll be basically just AT&T and T-Mobile and a couple others, so like 8 or 9. We lease just the radio access network, getting to the tower. Once it's in the tower, then it goes onto our stuff, our links, our communication path, comes through us, and then goes usually through VPN to the customer. So it's a secure path, and that's how we manage.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the data transport layer and the analytics layer is actually getting commoditized. But what you did not touch upon is the condition-based monitoring aspect of machine-to-machine communication, right? So do you think there is room to grow and expand in condition-based monitoring?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But then why aren't you doing it? You or some of your competitors.
I think the overall breadth of technology innovation is large here in the machine space. So back to innovation, I still think we're in the first quartile. So I think there's plenty of room for innovation and growth. I think that in order to really understand what to do, though, you have to have access to customers. And so customers are often what drives innovation. It's hard to do innovation in a vacuum. And so there are not a lot of entities that have sufficient interaction with the customers in order to be able to know how to spend their development dollars and where to innovate. And if you look at just one part of the chain, and if you don't have the right access to customers, it's not going to allow you to deploy whatever part of the chain that you just developed. Now, as to us and why we haven't done it, it's just simply, it's pretty much what I just talked about. There's so much that is going on that we're trying to do the things that we think customers want first, but the whole world of bringing down costs and being able to get people to pay for only what they want, when they want it, how they need it, is huge in terms of how we think about this industry. And if you think about gazillions of devices, how else is the market going to grow? If you take a trillion device, or you take 1 billion devices, and if there's 30% wastage, and then costs then guess what? You're not going to have 1 billion devices. I mean, that's just the way it works. So driving down costs and understanding the right way to drive down costs, I think, is critical to the industry.